Lecture 2. The Foundations of Plato's Philosophy.
In this second lecture, we'll look at where Platonism came from. No philosophical theory ever just happens. In fact, nothing ever just happens. Everything that begins has causes. And even though the primary cause of a philosophy is the mind of the philosopher, which is something spiritual and inward and personal, there are always external causes too. The philosopher's influences and predecessors. They act as catalysts in the spiritual chemistry of the reaction that takes place in the philosopher's mind. Or, to change the analogy, they act like food for thought. Now, I think there were two main catalysts for Plato's big idea, Plato's theory of forms, in his social and historical background. And these two were as opposite as any two things could possibly be, ancient myth and Socrates' logic. But they both combined to lead Plato to the same insight. Let's look at myth first. The word myth means literally sacred story. A myth does not necessarily mean something false, except to a cynic and a skeptic, but it means something that claims to teach a truth in symbols. Symbolic thinking is very close to Platonic philosophy, as C.S. Lewis explained in that long quote I read about symbolism and allegory in my last lecture. When I speak of mythic thinking, I mean both the thinking that makes the myths in the first place and the thinking that hears them and enjoys them. The essence of all mythic thinking is in one way very different than Platonic thinking because it's concrete rather than abstract. Myths are stories about divine or semi-divine heroes. They're not definitions of universal ideas. But in another way, myth is very similar to Platonic philosophy, that these heroes are archetypes, superhuman models for the persons and events in the lower world that imitate them and image them, as Platonic forms are archetypes for the things and events that are the images of them in the world of matter and appearance. Each archetype is one perfect model for many imperfect imitations or images. Both in the myths and in Plato's philosophy, the archetypes have an exalted quality, a perfection. They're paradigms. They have an authority over human lives that imitate them. Now, myths symbolize this in two ways, by time and by space. They're exalted in time by being put into the sacred past, when the gods were on earth, or at least closer to the earth. And are exalted in space by being put into the heavens, at the top of the cosmic totem pole, while we mortals are somewhere near the middle. By the way, all pre-modern thinking sees the cosmos as a hierarchy, a kind of a totem pole. Huston Smith, describing primitive religions, says, "What is probably the most important single feature of primal spirituality is its symbolist mentality. The symbolist vision sees the world as transparent to its divine source. Human ancestors are viewed as prolongations of the tribe's earliest ancestors who were divine. This makes them the bridge that connects the current generation with its first and supreme ancestor, who is also its archetype." Now, thoroughly materialistic minds, who can't even imagine anyone believing in a reality that is both spiritual and supernatural, always interpret myth as primitive science. So that Apollo, for instance, the sun god, is to them only a primitive symbol for the sun. I think, in fact, it was exactly the opposite. The sun was a symbol for Apollo. Jupiter was not a crude, primitive way of referring to thunder. Thunder was his rage. Neptune was not a pre-scientific version of sodium chloride suspended in 2 parts of hydrogen plus 1 part of oxygen. Why would they camouflage the fact that there's a lot of salt water out there by talking about a very large invisible man with windy breath? Neptune was not a symbol of the sea was a symbol of Neptune. Primitives, you see, were much more interested in gods than in gases, because they were more interested in persons than in things. And I think that made them not nearly as primitive as modern scientific thinkers who are more interested in things than in persons, and who reduce even persons to things, like gases and genes. This symbolism involves hierarchy. Eternal archetypes are superior to their earthly examples, and that's a very unmodern notion. Science knows a kind of hierarchy too, but that's only a quantitative and material hierarchy, a hierarchy only of size, where the macrocosm or larger world is simply 13 or 14 billion years long and billions of galaxies wide, and the microcosm, the smaller world, is simply the particles of matter and energy that combine to make the visible world. So, at most, science admits only a hierarchy of complexity. Human brains are more complex than stars. But complexity is still a quantitative notion. You have to quantify something before it becomes an object of exact science. But the hierarchy of Platonic thinking is a qualitative hierarchy, a hierarchy of value, with the absolute ruling principle being the good. The only values that science can deal with are quantitative values, like the value of money. The Platonic forms are ontologically better, metaphysically more real, more authentic, more than the physical things that exemplify them, just as you are more real than photos of you, and as one photo is more authentic than another photo, so one person is more authentic, more human than another, more or less a real man or a real woman. But none of us is perfect humanity itself. Here's the difference between Plato and the typically modern mind. The typically modern mind believes that these archetypes, these qualitative forms that we use as our standards of value measurement, are inventions of our mind. But Plato thought they were as real as rocks. There are only two options when it comes to values and qualities, as distinct from just scientific material quantities. Either the truth is objective or it's subjective. Either we find these things or we make them. When we think of things like justice or beauty or virtue or goodness or life or soul, our minds either enter into something greater than ourselves and conform to it, or else we create it, we invent it, as we invent languages and social systems and laws, and that's the typically modern option. Now, myth is the earliest pre-philosophical form of the alternative option, and Platonism is the earliest philosophical form of it. Whether the superior truth that we conform to is a mythical god or a Platonic idea, both are versions of a hierarchical worldview, a cosmic order, a larger-than-life meaning and purpose and intelligibility and truth and rationality that we discover and believe and know and live and conform to and find our authentic selves in only by that conformity. The alternative philosophy, the more typically modern one, is that it's we who make all reason and order and meaning and purpose, except perhaps in science. In the more typically modern worldview, the scientific method is the only method of finding objective truth, and all this Platonic stuff is only myth in the sense of something fictitious. Now, Platonism is not a religion, but a philosophy, but it's most easily understood by a religious parallel. The two options, religiously expressed, would be that either God created us in his image, or we created him in ours. Either he wrote the play we're in, or we're writing it. Either we're the players, or we're the authors. And that second modern option, judged by the religious standpoint, is the basic violation of the very first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, the commandment against idolatry. And the primary idolatry would be to worship ourselves. I know one psychologist, Paul Vitz, who says that America is the most polytheistic nation in history because we worship not 1,000 gods or 10,000 gods, but 350 million gods. In the Republic, Plato severely criticized the Homeric myths that were the official state religion of ancient Athens because he admired and agreed with his teacher Socrates, who had been tried and executed as an atheist because he couldn't honestly confess that he believed in these gods as the state believed in them. But neither Socrates nor Plato were atheists. They were pious agnostic monotheists. They were agnostic about their myths because the myths and the gods of the myths were irrational. When Socrates speaks of the gods, he's not really serious, but when he speaks of the god in the singular, he is. The gods all have names. The god in the singular is nameless. The unknown god that some Athenians were still worshipping 450 years later when St. Paul visited Athens was the god Socrates worshipped, and the only one that Paul, like Socrates, approved of. In Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, Socrates asks Euthyphro the crucial question, is a thing good merely because the gods love it, or do they love it because it is good? Euthyphro thinks it's the first. His gods are the willful, arbitrary, irrational tyrants of Greek mythology. Socrates thinks it's the second option. His god is rational and moral and wills only good. And that's just about all that Socrates claims to know about God. In Socrates, the sun of reason has risen and dispelled the fogs of myth. Socrates, more than any other single person in history, invented the new way of thinking that we call reason. It's Socrates who sharply separated and distinguished reason from mythical thinking. Instead of relying on blind feelings and blind faith in the stories of Homer, which rose from the unconscious imagination and appealed to the imagination, Socrates demanded conscious reasons and definitions and arguments. Socrates was the first person who seemed to clearly know what a logical argument was. A few decades later, Aristotle based the world's first logic textbook on Socrates' lived example. Now, how did Socrates' logic contribute to Plato's big idea, the theory of forms? In this way, an argument proves its conclusion only if it passes 3 checkpoints. Its terms must be clear, its premises must be true, and its logic must be valid. The conclusion must logically follow from the premises. Now, it's this first thing, defining terms, that takes up most of the space in Plato's Socratic dialogues, finding out what our terms mean, making them clear. How do we do that? The answer is by definition. A definition expresses the universal and necessary and unchangeable essence of the thing defined, unlike concrete examples which only express what is particular and accidental and changeable. For instance, you can't define a man as a Greek, or as an adult, or as somebody who looks like Plato, even though Greeks and adults and people who look like Plato are indeed men. You must define man by omitting all the changeable and particular features and find the universal essence. Man is essentially a rational animal, a living organism with a soul capable of reason. That is his essence. A definition always seeks the essence of a thing. Now, if there really are no essences, there can be no real definitions, only nominal definitions. That is, only reports about how we have conventionally agreed to use words. Each Socratic dialogue searches for an essence. That's why Socrates always asks the question, what is this thing? And since Socrates was a very practical man who knew that he had only one lifetime to spend, to save time, he concentrated on the most important things to define, which were almost always moral values. For instance, in the Laches, he asks, what is courage? The Lysis asks, what is friendship? The Meno asks, what is teaching? The Republic asks, what is justice? It's always a what is. The what is the essence, as distinct from the appearances or the particular examples, the instances. And these definitions that Socrates sought are not just nominal definitions, definitions of names, conventions of usage, decisions about how to use words. They are real definitions, definitions of real essences, the essences of real things. They're either right or wrong, true or false. They're not decisions of will about how we want to use words. They're acts of understanding, intellectual insights into the real natures of things. In other words, Socrates is always looking for some Platonic form. All Plato did in his theory of forms was to explain what Socrates was doing, and to erect a metaphysical foundation under Socrates' logical quest. So both the irrational myths and the demythologized reasoning of Socrates contributed to the same Platonic theory of forms. The forms are both archetypes and definitions. They function as archetypes when they're expressed concretely in mythic symbols, and they function as definitions when they're expressed abstractly in logical arguments. Every one of Plato's 30 dialogues centers on a form, a what. I'll summarize each of them, but I want to spend most of our time on the Apology of Socrates, Plato's paean of praise to his master. I think this is probably the greatest secular speech in the history of Western civilization. It's a defense not only of Socrates, but of the life of philosophy that he is being martyred for, and a defense of the kind of human being and the kind of human life which is defined most perfectly by Socrates himself. The very last line of the Apology says that Socrates was, "Of all men then living, of all we ever met, the best, the wisest, and the most just." At the heart of the Apology, we find a riddling reference to an implied but not expressed definition of that Platonic form that is in one way the primary one, the self. What is the essence of the self? Know thyself was the first commandment of the god of the Delphic oracle, who inspired Socrates to become a philosopher. And now, in the Apology, Socrates reveals that he has solved the oracle's riddle. But he reveals this in a riddling way, indirectly, not directly. Watch how cleverly he does this. His deepest conviction, expressed twice in the Apology with the warning words, "You will laugh and jeer at this, but please listen, because this is going to sound outrageous," is that no evil can ever possibly happen to a good man, in this world or in the next. And Socrates claims to be certain of this apparently ridiculous thing. Socrates doubts and questions everything, even common-sense platitudes. He's almost a skeptic. But he claims to be certain of a few things, just a very few things. And each of these few things is an outrageous paradox, a deep surprise. For instance, that evil is only ignorance, or that learning is only remembering. His certainties are paradoxes. And the certainty he expresses in the Apology, that no evil can ever happen to a good man, is the single most important certainty of all. It can change your life. It means that there's only one thing necessary, being good. And if you are, then no evil can ever happen to you. What justifies that strange conviction? It seems not only strange, but absurd, because evil is happening to a good man right now, as Socrates is uttering these words, that it can't. For Socrates is about to be unjustly executed precisely because he's good and honest, and cannot honestly profess a faith in the wicked gods of the state that he didn't really believe in. So why is Socrates certain that the very situation that he is in is not what it seems to be? That it's not evil happening to a good man? The answer is that Socrates has discovered the essence of a man. He has solved the riddle of the oracle, know thyself. Your self is your soul, your inner self, your personality, your character. That's Socrates' implicit answer to know thyself, the great puzzle written over the door of the temple of the Delphic oracle, the only Greek god Socrates ever took seriously. This oracle gave Socrates his philosophical vocation by declaring that no one in the world was wiser than Socrates, which made Socrates puzzle over this riddle because he knew that he had no wisdom at all. The puzzle was a beautiful irony because the oracle was using the Socratic method of questioning, riddling, rather than answering, to teach Socrates to use the Socratic method to unravel the riddle. For Socrates went around trying to find a wise man by questioning supposedly wise men, so that he finally discovered what wisdom was, knowing that you had no wisdom, that only God had wisdom. This is what made Socrates a philosopher. In fact, the first and archetypal philosopher, the grandfather of all other philosophers, beginning with Plato. And now, in his swan song, his last speech, the Apology, Socrates shows, indirectly, that he has found the answer to the oracle's primary riddle, know thyself. The self is the soul, and therefore no other man, but only I, can make myself good or evil, wise or foolish, virtuous or vicious. So no evil can just happen to me. No other man can harm my soul, only my body. If he kills me unjustly, he harms only his soul, not mine. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. The soul was the first Platonic form that Socrates discovered, the essential self, the form of himself. We could go so far as to say that it was Socrates who, for the first time, clearly discovered the psyche. Because before Socrates, the Greek word psyche meant ghost. It was the less real, less solid, less human image that survived the death of the body. Sort of like a ghost image that sometimes flickers for a second on a TV screen after you turn it off. But for Socrates, the body is the image of the soul, not vice versa. When Socrates announced that the essence of the self was the soul, his contemporaries must have thought that he was crazy, because he seemed to them to be saying that your true self is your ghost. Unfortunately, most of us are still primitive pre-Socratic thinkers when we think of the soul, for when our movies show the soul departing from the body at death, it's always a ghost, a cloud, something insubstantial. If Socrates made a movie about death, I think he'd show the body as the cloud, a kind of a rainbow, a short-lived, barely substantial thing. And the soul would look like a bar of iron. The body is part of me only because it's the home of the soul, for a little while. After I die, my corpse is no longer me, but my soul is. So the soul is the first Platonic form to be discovered, and the most important one. For if you don't know yourself, then you don't know who it is that knows anything else. Socrates was probably the second most influential person in the history of Western civilization, next to Jesus. For what distinguishes Western civilization above all is respect for reason and rational morality, and these stem from Socrates more than anyone else. Even modern science, which has changed our lives so radically, stems historically from philosophy. Each of the sciences came to develop its own method and independence from philosophy, like children moving away from home, and the father of all philosophy is Socrates. Renaissance humanists regularly cited Socrates as the primary example of the righteous pagan. Aquinas called him the greatest of all philosophers in explaining why Socrates never wrote anything. He said that, like Christ, he had no need to teach by writing, because his teaching was of a higher order. Socrates is philosophy's Christ. All other philosophers depend on him through Plato, who is like his single intellectual missionary and evangelist, sort of like a Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul all rolled into one. The way the dialogues show us what a thing is not simply by a verbal definition announced at the end of a process of merely logical analysis. A Platonic dialogue is a wonderfully complex, multi-layered thing, always with a deep psychological dimension and a kind of a dramatic dimension. It's a journey. And each character in the journey represents somebody or something in the soul of each one of us. Each dialogue has a lot of dramatic human interaction in it, as well as logical interaction. So there's a double way to see the form that it's searching for. Plato began his career as a dramatic poet, and he publicly burned the dramas he had written when he met Socrates, to dramatize his conversion to philosophy. Fortunately, Plato did not and couldn't burn the dramatist in his heart. Sometimes the drama of a Platonic dialogue ends by finding the form that they seek, as in the Republic, and sometimes they don't, as in the Meno. But even when they don't, they always do in a sense, for they find at least what it isn't, which is like finding the negative photographic image of it. Finding what it's not is a stage towards finding what it is, because we always begin by confusing what it is with some of the things that it's not. So we have to be dispossessed of this garbage before we can eat the right food. Socrates is more often our garbage man than our chef. Readers are often frustrated by Socrates because after pages of argument, he often doesn't come to any positive conclusion. But you shouldn't be frustrated by that, not because he's trying to make you a skeptic, but because he's trying to make you a philosopher. He could cook your mental food for you, but he won't. He cleans your mental kitchen so you can do your own cooking. We're never allowed to be passive with Socrates and let him feed us like baby birds passively letting mama bird put worms in their mouths. We have to go out and hunt. Socrates invites us on a hunting expedition. And even in the later dialogues of Plato, written long after Socrates died, when the living example of Socrates recedes and the dialogues have less personal drama and more positive philosophical conclusions, they always remain dialogues, dramas of ideas, unpredictable journeys. What we're looking for in these journeys is always a universal. The special sciences also seek universal formulas like E equals mc squared, but this is still partial, not universal knowledge. Physics is not biology, and biology is not math. But in a sense, philosophy is the study of everything. In the Republic, Plato defines the distinctiveness of the philosopher in this way. The philosopher is the one who seeks the whole of beauty or justice or wisdom or whatever the form is that he's seeking, rather than only some part or some area or some examples as the special sciences do. Now, whether this holistic knowledge is a valid aim, whether it's possible to be such a generalist, whether there are universals that are knowable, that's precisely the question that divides Platonists and anti-Platonists throughout the history of philosophy. It divides two kinds of colleges and universities in America today. Some see philosophy merely as a postscript, a service department. Others, in the minority today, see philosophy as central and substantive. Are we satisfied with partial, specific knowledge, or are we dissatisfied until we find universal forms, find wholes? To aim at the universal is also to be dissatisfied, to be more idealistic, more demanding. This dissatisfaction means personal involvement, personal passion. Philosophy betrays itself when it turns into an impersonal academic subject. Philosophy is not a subject for Plato. It's a love, an eros, a hunger. To be a philosopher, according to Plato, we have to be hungry. We have to be invested in the drama of ideas, to understand them. We can never sit back passively and just be amused by them like spectators at a movie. To use the food analogy, the dialogues are culinary adventures in cooking, not pre-cooked TV dinners. So they're really impossible to summarize, for their logical summary is only one dimension of them. The psychological dimension is just as important, maybe even more important, because that's what the logic is there for the personal drama of conversion, the healing of souls. Socrates, like Jesus and like Buddha, is never simply a professor, a lecturer, or a writer, like almost all other philosophers, beginning with Aristotle. The only other philosophers I can think of who give us this personal dimension as well as the logical, who aim at converting, turning us around 180 degrees, changing our very selves and not just our thoughts, are Augustine and Pascal and Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche as the polar opposite of all three. For Nietzsche, the cave is precisely Plato's world of forms, and their metaphysical home in the Judeo-Christian God. I'll talk more later about Nietzsche as the total anti-Platonist. So we can imagine each Socratic dialogue as a hunting expedition and the form that the dialogue seeks as the animal that's being hunted. Thus, the symposium hunts for the form of love. That's why it's probably Plato's most popular and beautifully written dialogue. The Republic is, of course, about justice, the same form in both the individual soul and in the city-state. Book 1 of the Republic is a typical early Socratic dialogue in which Socrates, after logically refuting 3 wrong definitions of justice, is left with no right definition and is dissatisfied because he hasn't yet found the form. And the practical payoff, the reason we need to find it, is because without it we can't prove that justice is more profitable than injustice, that it alone brings happiness. That's why the Republic is so important. It's about the most important question in the world: the good for man, the greatest good, the meaning of life, how to live. By the end of Book 1, Socrates has proved this conclusion by logical argument, that justice is always more profitable than injustice. But he's not convinced, and we're not supposed to be convinced either, because we didn't know what we were talking about. We didn't know the form, the essence, the real nature of justice. So it takes about 300 more pages to do that. Book 1, in other words, only climbed as high as the third step on the divided line, logical reasoning. It didn't get to the fourth and highest step, the understanding of the essence. Once we get that, almost 300 pages later, through Plato's long political detour that shows us this hard-to-find, invisible form of justice in the soul, by first showing us the easier-to-find, visible, public form of justice in the state. Once we know that form of justice, we're then and only then totally convinced that justice is for our profit, for our good, for our happiness. You see, we see it. We don't just calculate it. We understand it. And that's the goal of every dialogue, the understanding of what it is. And that is the only thing that totally convinces us and satisfies us. That's the fourth step of the divided line. That's the highest step in our education. The Republic argues that philosophy is needed for societies as well as for souls, because only the knowledge of the forms can judge the shadows in the cave. Only the knowledge of ideal justice can understand and repair real injustices. As Socrates argues, if a shuttle is broken in the making, will the maker make a second one, looking to the broken one as his standard, or will he look to the form according to which he made the first one? Well, what's true of shuttles is also true of states and of souls, that is, persons. Only if we know the design for a person do we know what it is to be one, and how to judge success in being one, how to avoid getting A's in all your subjects but flunking life. The early dialogues always seek to know and define the form of a particular virtue. Friendship in the Lysis, courage in the Laches, temperance in the Charmides. The Philebus is about the essential nature of pleasure and its relation to the supreme good. The Phaedrus explores the nature of mystical experience, divine madness, which is what happens when we find the form of beauty. The Phaedo hunts for the meaning of death. Plato first argues about it and then actually presents it at the end, the death of Socrates. When the idea of death and the idea of Socrates thus meet in our minds, it is the idea of death that is changed. The Meno seems to hunt for the nature of virtue, which it never finds, but I think it really hunts for the nature of education, or of learning, which it does find as a remembering of the forms which we all already knew unconsciously, so that philosophical education is like intellectual psychoanalysis, bringing our unconscious wisdom up to the light of consciousness. The Theaetetus hunts for the form of knowledge, which is distinguished from both bodily sense perception and mere opinion or belief. The Gorgias is the one dialogue I'd have everyone read if I had to choose only one, because it's like the Republic without the politics. It's about the good, the greatest good, the summum bonum, the meaning of life. The Parmenides is about unity, or the one, oneness. That's a form as elusive and as absolute as the good and the beautiful. For these three are ultimately three names for the same reality. All the other forms are plural and fit on the fourth and highest step of the Republic's divided line. But the one, or the good, is above them all because all the other forms participate in it. It is the one absolutely absolute absolute, and it is single, and it is infinite. Infinite was a rare admission for a Greek to make, for infinity to the typical ancient Greek mind was an imperfection, not a perfection. To the Greek mind, only matter was infinite and formless and therefore imperfect, and it was only finite form that made it perfect, as it does in any work of art. But in the Republic, Socrates amazed his hearers by saying that the good is infinite, and therefore it's not definable as the other forms are, such as justice. So it can only be known through parable or symbol or analogy, through what it's like. It's like the sun. The sun gives light, and light symbolizes truth, definable truth, but the good itself transcends definition just as the sun transcends its light. It's the source of all light. It's not a lit object. You can't shine a light on the sun. So the sun is the source of all light, as the idea of the good is the source of all truth. Everything is what it is because it is somehow good. The good, the end, the point, the purpose, what Aristotle would call the final cause. This is the ultimate explanation. This is the ultimate truth of everything. This good is also beauty. Beauty is not definable as a form in the symposium either, but it's only reached by a kind of mystical experience after ascending all the rungs of a spiritual ladder. The sophist, not surprisingly, is about the sophist, and the statesman is about the statesman, and the laws is about laws. The ion is about the arts, especially the art of rhetoric, and how it differs from philosophical wisdom, because rhetoric does not know the abstract universal, only the concrete particular. And it shows how the power of a great art is a matter of divine inspiration. The Cratulus is about the essence of language, and about the myth of an original archetypal language, which was the Platonic form and ideal for all later languages. The Critias is about the form or pattern of history, and finds its essential nature to be cyclical and devolutionary, a most unmodern view. The Timaeus is about the essential nature of the physical universe and the four causes of its creation. Aristotle's four causes, probably the single most universally useful organizing principle in the history of human thought, depends directly on the four eternals in Plato's Timaeus. First, the forms. Second, the receptacle of form, which is matter or space. Third, the agent or creator who imposes form on matter, the efficient cause. And fourth, the good as the motive and end and final cause of all creation. So here you have the formal, material, efficient, and final causes of Aristotle. Finally, there is no dialogue at all about the most important thing of all, Plato's big idea, the idea of the good itself. In his 7th letter, he refers to some book that was circulating in Athens entitled On the Good by Plato. And he says in this letter that this book is a fake, that he would and could never write such a book. Because the good, the ultimate good, Plato's equivalent of God, this can be known, he says, only when two minds strike each other together in the search for truth, like flint and steel, and produce a sudden spark, like lightning. That's what has to happen when you read Plato. A lightning bolt suddenly hits your mind if you're in dialogue with Plato and with yourself, if you identify with all the characters, if this dialogue happens in your soul as well as in your book. You have an aha experience. You see. And then you know a tiny bit of heaven for just a split second. If that second could last forever, if you could just see the what of everything, well, then you would know why God never gets bored. And then perhaps you would look forward to dying with hope and excitement as a baby looks forward to being born, or as a prisoner looks forward to escaping from his cave. Plato wrote his dialogues to help us to do exactly that. That's the meaning of education, real education, which means literally a leading out. I know no better way to begin your education than by reading Plato's dialogues, and I wish you all an exciting journey and a happy ending. If Whitehead summarized the history of Western philosophy as a series of footnotes to Plato, we'll look in our next lecture at the three most influential of these footnotes: Aristotle's Hylomorphism, Plotinus's Neoplatonism, and Augustine's Christian Platonism.
This ends Lecture 2.